Never say you're not afraid of the dark, because darkness is not something you see, it's something you feel. It creeps into your mind, making you question every move, every sound. And when you're alone in an old abandoned house where every corner seems alive, the darkness begins to play its game. Igor had never believed in stories about the paranormal, much less ghosts. It all seemed silly to him. But everything changed when he found an old note in the basement. It was written on a yellowed sheet of paper, and the words on it were full of fear. Don't go out at night. Don't look at your face. He will come when you close your eyes. He will take them. Will take your face. Igor laughed at first, but there was one detail that kept all this from being forgotten: the smell. The smell of blood. He had smelled it in that basement, in that forgotten corner of the house. The smell of iron, like someone had been here before him for a long time. And that smell wouldn't go away. Soon Igor realized that the house was holding him for a reason. When he returned to his room, his whole world suddenly changed. He turned to the mirror and saw something. A few seconds later, Igor stood, breathless, in complete dumbness. His reflection didn't have his face on it, just a lifeless void covered in cracks. And from those cracks, flesh slowly began to stick. It was a face, but it was made of torn lips. Pale lumps of meat, sagging and stretched like deliberately mutilated tissue. A face that had no place in this world. He didn't know what it was, who it was, why it was him. But his heart had already begun to realize this was the beginning. And it was only the beginning. Igor recoiled from the mirror, as if it could swallow him up, take him over. His eyes quickly searched for an answer, but there was only darkness in the room. He tried to breathe, but the air seemed heavy, almost viscous, as if the house itself didn't want him here. He turned away from the mirror, but something kept moving in his mind. That face, its disfigured features, those grinning lips that seemed like they shouldn't have been alive. It was distorted, but there was something familiar about it, something Igor couldn't understand. He took a step back and felt the cold in his feet, as if the entire space around him had frozen. Without waiting, he ran to the door, but as soon as his hand touched the knob, the lights in the room went out. Complete, utter darkness. He heard a click, and suddenly there was a scraping sound somewhere in the corner of the room. It wasn't the sound of an old house. No, it was something alive. "You can't leave," came a familiar whisper, the same one that had sounded in his head even before he had seen the mirror. Igor froze, his heart pounding frantically in his ears. He tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. The back of his neck was covered in cold sweat, and like an invisible hand, the darkness wrapped around his body, squeezing it. And suddenly a quiet, almost imperceptible sound. A creak. Footsteps. Footsteps. Igor turned to look in the corner where there had been nothing before, but now there was something standing there. It was a dark creature, something unknown. Only its eyes were visible, two bright, brilliant pupils that glittered like sharp blades in the darkness. "You can't leave like that," the voice whispered again, but now it was quite close. Igor couldn't feel his feet anymore. He knew this wasn't just a nightmare. He felt that this was reality. The creature took another step, and then Igor saw something like dark hands covered in clots of blood, and meat began to grow out of its dark figure. He tried to scream, but his voice disappeared into the dark, misty void. The creature brought its hand up to his face, and the second he felt the cold and wet touch his cheek, his eyes glazed over. He saw the very face that was now becoming part of this creature appear in the reflection on the floor. The lips began to spread, their shapeless edges sticking together, stretching into a mad, hideous smile. The creature laughed hoarsely, and Igor felt his own face lose its shape. It began to spread. Igor knew that this was only the beginning, and that there was nothing he could do to stop the process. He was too late. The darkness in the room shrank like a vice, and every breath Igor took was heavy, as if the air were filled with the very pulling force that was eating him. He felt his body gradually losing control, as if something invisible but tangible was pulling him into the abyss. He couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't even close his eyes. The creature stood before him, its face a brain mass hanging from beneath its sagging lips, as if it were not part human but a creature born in hell. Its eyes burned like two cold flames, and the emptiness was reflected in those lights. He could see tears pouring from the black eye sockets, bloody tears. The creature's lips, torn and stretched, began to slowly rise into a ghastly smile. It was not human. That smile was a congratulatory one. "You're already here." The voice was low, muffled, as if someone was whispering it into his heart. "We need you." Igor didn't understand what it meant, but instinctively he knew he shouldn't stay here. He rushed to the door, huddled in the corner, and finally tried with all his might to pull the handle, but it wouldn't budge. He began to hammer on it hysterically, almost blindly, but nothing happened. His hands were freezing cold, and dark shadows were already floating in his eyes. He couldn't tell how much time had passed. The creature stayed close. It didn't move, but he could feel its presence. "You see him," it said, and its lips opened slightly, as if about to tell a secret. "He's always with you. He's looking for you." Igor froze. Who was looking for him? He looked around, but there was nothing in the darkness but the shadow of the creature. "He's already in you," the voice echoed, its sound traveling from one corner of the room to the other. At that moment Igor felt something cold and sharp, like a knife, piercing his chest. It was inside his body, in his organs, in his blood. Suddenly he realized he couldn't move. The creature stepped forward, and its lips began to spread. That terrible, distorted mouth opened as if it were yawning at something alive, something with no soul or mind, something old, something ancient. "It has come for you." The creature pulled its hand, and in that moment Igor saw it, a face, his own face, but absent. All that was left were mere bits of his skin, the canvas of his lips torn away, as if someone had deliberately ripped his face out. The flames in the creature's eyes intensified, and Igor felt his heart slowly grow cold. He couldn't resist any longer. He realized that he was no longer human. He had become what he had always feared. A face. Igor stood, consumed by fear, his body no longer obeying him. The dark creature stood before him, and with each step it seemed to merge with the surrounding shadows, becoming part of this dark world. He tried to breathe, but the air did not bring relief. On the contrary, it became heavier and heavier. His chest felt like it was bursting with pain. The creature was slowly approaching. He could hear its footsteps sounding in the void as they echoed in his head. It was in no hurry. It knew that Igor could no longer escape. The creature's lips, stretched and sagging, began to quiver, and suddenly Igor saw huge black tentacles begin to emerge from the void of his own reflection. They did not touch his body, but their presence was unbearably palpable. The tentacles began to burst out of his chest, pulling something out of him that Igor couldn't understand. It was as heavy as darkness, but with each new movement it became more and more real. "You are already with us." The creature's voice was as deep and vile as its eyes. It resounded in his mind like an eternal vibration. "Your face, it would never come back." Igor felt his hands begin to deaden, as if his body was no longer subject to him. He had no control over anything. His legs were shaking and he had no strength to stand. The second he tried to move, his hand passed through the dark fabric of space, and an image burst into his mind. He saw himself, but not as he was. His face was gone, and in its place was only a black abyss covered with hundreds of torn lips stretched into a mute scream. He felt his essence begin to dissolve. His body was no longer his, it had become part of this world. "We've all been consumed by this place," the creature said without moving. It paced toward Igor, almost inaudible. "You are now what you have always been, the one who will be here, in this place, in this shadow." Igor tried to scream, but his mouth wouldn't move. It was like a nightmare from which it was impossible to wake up. He tried to take a step back, but he lost his orientation in space. The world shrank around him, wall after wall, room after room. It wasn't just space, it was a trap, where those who lose touch with themselves for too long fall into. The mirror reflected his face again, but it was no longer human. Just torn pieces of skin and mutilated lips. Not a face, just emptiness. And then he realized, this wasn't the end, it was the beginning. The creature came close, and despite its unnatural shape, hot breath began to pour from its cracks, from those very distorted lips, as if it were inhaled fire. "You know you're different now." Igor felt his body being squeezed by something unspeakable, and all that was left was to absorb the darkness, to dissolve into it. The essence was gone, identity erased, his face became part of the world. Igor didn't know how much time had passed. It seemed that his consciousness had become stretched like rubber, and in this stretching time all that remained was his sensation. His body no longer responded to thoughts, no longer obeyed what was left of his mind. The shadow left of Igor continued to exist, but it was no longer his. The creature's lips grew brighter each time, as if they were beaming light into an empty room. Black seams were tearing at their center, and from their cracks flowed not blood, but an unimaginable substance unlike anything earthly. It was life, but not human life. It was something ancient, unseen, consuming. The creature that stood before him no longer resembled the one who had been his source of fear. It was something formless, but nonetheless possessing purpose. Its hands, covered in dark fleshy growths, reached out to Igor, but not to grab. It slowly stretched toward him, as if manipulating the shadow like a marionette. You can't hear anymore. You can't see as you were. Your shell is but a shadow. You have become part of us. The creature did not breathe, but its words still penetrated Igor's consciousness, making him vulnerable, subjugating him. He felt this absorption intensifying, his thoughts falling apart. Igor tried to resist, but every movement seemed lifeless, as if he could no longer interact with the world. But suddenly, an image flashed through his mind. He saw her, a face, the same one that had disappeared, the face that had once been his. The face with the lips torn off, but now it wasn't just ugly, it was cursed. Igor realized that it wasn't just a vision, it was what was left of him. It was his face, but now it was part of this being, part of this endless darkness. His own lips began to open, as if they were pulling themselves into a ghastly smile. There was no pain in them, no fear. All there was absorption. Igor lost the ability to feel alive. The creature's lips, which continued to grow, began to glue themselves to his body. This wasn't violence, it was a merger, a merging with something as empty and desperate as the darkness itself. Igor felt his consciousness dissolve. He became part of this dark world, part of a face. His face had become one of them, but now there was no turning back. He couldn't breathe, he couldn't think. All that was left was what had once been him. The creature smiled, its lips spreading all the way to his ears. He was home now.